he invited us to be sure and come and say hello to him when we were in California. In the middle of our visit there, he said, well, Edward Weston is in town, that is in San Francisco. So we were introduced, he shook hands, and we had a very pleasant drive to Carmel. And we arrived at this very small house, almost a shack, and there, standing in the doorway to greet us, was Edward's wife, Caris. And we had dinner, and we became really good friends in a very general way. And he got out his photographic lamp and set up a tripod and gave us a show of his photographs. That's the only use that Edward ever had for artificial light, was that lamp that he used to show off his work. Edward was very generous indeed. He invited me to develop my negatives in his darkroom. Now let me say that his darkroom was really sparse. When I showed him the negatives, he said, why don't you print them? So I printed them. And when I showed him the prints, he said, why didn't you dodge them? Why, look at this. It needs to be dodged to bring out the detail, or the shadows are all clogged up. And, well, that was my first real lesson. I had read about this movement called F64, and they absolutely no fussing with the printing at all, no retouching, not allowed. And so full of this that when Edward Weston said, why didn't you dodge? I could only reply, did you say dodge, Mr. Weston? And he laughed, and so I learned that the F64 group was not unaware of after work on negative and print.
In 1946, Edward Weston went to New York to see the exhibition of 260 of his photographs at the Museum of Modern Art that Nancy Newhall had assembled. He was so fascinated by the show that he would sit in the gallery chairs with a sack lunch, greeting the visitors as they came to see his work.
The selection of photographs was entirely that of Edward and Nancy. They had a little bit of disagreement. One was the number of prints. Edward wanted 500 prints in the exhibition, and Nancy said that's too many. She said, well, in an exhibition like this, you can't really see 500 prints. And Edward's answer to that was very simple and direct and characteristic. He just said, let them come twice to look at the photographs. Well, the trustees of the Museum of Modern Art were very puritanical, and they were not a bit happy with the nude photographs, in particular those that had a peek at what one of the secretaries called public hair. And Edward was very amused by all this, and Nancy was aware of this problem. And so she and Edward deliberately put in the selection a number of pictures showing nudes of this type. Nancy was fully aware that the trustees would not allow these to be shown, and she put in some just so they could throw them out. Edward was very amused by all of this, and so was Caris. And Caris sent us a negative that Edward had made of herself in the nude in the backyard of their house at Carmel, and covering over the pubic hair with a fig leaf.
Weston's love of photography easily enabled him to share his enthusiasm with others. Many fortunate people who studied and worked with him often felt that this contact was so influential that it changed their lives.
I was young, and I wanted to study photography. I was living in San Francisco, and I'd seen the work of Edward Weston and fallen in love with it. And he was very famous, so I thought he was rich. I mean, don't those go together? When you're young, you think so. And I was in Carmel one weekend, and I looked up his address in the phone book, and I drove out past his mailbox. He had a big mailbox for shipping. Looked like a big doghouse with Edward Weston on top in the Carmel Highlands, south of Carmel, past Point Lobos. And that was so he could, the mailbox was so that he could get ship-mounted prints back and forth for exhibitions. Of course, I later learned. At any rate, I didn't know him. And I rang the number, and this rather quiet voice answered, hello. I thought it would be a secretary. So I asked to speak to Edward Weston. I mean, this man was rich. He must be famous. He was living in a very wealthy area of the coast there. And he said, this is Edward Weston. That was all. And I said, I introduced, gave him my name and said I wanted to talk to him. And he said, what do you want to talk to me about? And I said, photography. And he said, fine, that's my favorite subject.
Near the end of Edward Weston's life, some of his family and friends thought that he should make a body of photographic prints that would represent his entire career at its best. Two of his sons, Brett and Cole, were closely involved in creating this series of project prints, which have generated their own body of lore, opinion, and occasional controversy.
And Brett was the chief person who did the printing. And he made, I think it was 10 or a small number of prints of each negative. He gave up his own photography to benefit his father in a very generous and, to me, a very appealing way. He made good prints, but they were, of course, not Edward's prints. One cannot really compare prints by quality, but by the general feeling that the photographer puts into it. And Brett has one way of sensing a print, and Father had another way.
He was a very frail person, and he was had Parkinson's, and he couldn't print easily. It was a terrific ordeal for him. So I volunteered to print these under his direction. So he selected 1,000 negatives, boiled it down to about 850, and it took about 6 months to do it. But it was under his direction, and so they, in a sense, they were his prints. I was just an extension of his hands. And he would say, he would stagger out of the bathroom, and I'd make a print from that night. He'd select maybe eight negatives for that day, 6 or 8, and so I'd make a master print. Print that I liked. He said, no, Brad, you change it, dodge here, dodge there, and use a number 3 paper made or number 2. It was his work. Cole disputes that, but this is not so. It was his work.
And Dad and I chose all the negatives. We went through his 3,000 negatives, and he would say, what do you think about this one? What about this one? And he chose them, but I'd say, well, I think this one's better than that, or vice versa. So we ended up with some, I think 800 and some negatives, as I recall. It was, I don't remember exactly. Then Brett did the printing of them.
He thought that I had influenced my dad in the printmaking. I don't think so. They were his prints. There may be, I might have had some bearing on it, but essentially it was his judgment, not mine.
I think Brett did a good job. Some of them are not so hot, and some of them are magnificent. But As far as printing my father's work, people say, how do you do it? Well, it's pretty simple. First of all, I was trained with him for 12 years and lived with him until he died. But on all these negative sleeves, there is written instructions. It's a code number, like 227N, and then it'll say H-0-100 watt, means a haloid 100 watt bulb to print by. Then it's a exposure 15, and then it's a PDLS, print down left side, SSW, the small wire, 10. So all these instructions are on there, and as long as I know them, and I can follow them, and as long as I print not too contrasty and simply, I can pretty much come up with what he did. Not exactly the same, because the papers are different. I can take it out and show you better. Okay. And there's this line right here. You take a small wire and hold back the whole time up and down here, and then you burn in the foot a little bit here, and this the foot a little bit here, and that's the way it's printed. Carol's always said that she should have had her body copyrighted. She made a fortune.
He used his eyes so determinedly and so steadily that he frequently closed them just to rest them for a while, and everybody in the family kidded him if he actually did take a nap. We'd say, "Are you just resting your eyes?" But the fact is, he needed to rest them because he overworked them. And he used to do that when we'd be driving through long, dull stretches, as you often do. There isn't anything to see. Some Chinese philosopher or commenter on a Chinese philosopher says in a book somewhere, "As long as my eyes are open, I'm photographing the 10,000 things." And that's what Edward was doing.